Sarah Martinez had always been the smallest person in any room, but her determination was larger than anyone could imagine. Growing up in a small Texas town, she watched her father work as a paramedic, rushing out at all hours to save lives. When other kids played with dolls, Sarah practiced bandaging her stuffed animals and memorizing first aid procedures from her father's medical books. At 18, Sarah shocked everyone by enlisting in the Army. Her high school friends thought she was crazy. Her mother cried for 3 days straight. Even the recruitment officer looked surprised when this tiny 5'2" girl walked into his office and declared she wanted to become a combat medic. But Sarah had made up her mind. She wanted to save lives where it mattered most. Basic training nearly broke her. The other recruits towered over her, and some drill sergeants questioned whether she belonged there. During the first week, Sarah could barely complete the obstacle course. Her backpack seemed heavier than she was. Other trainees whispered that she would quit before the month ended. But every morning, Sarah got up before everyone else to practice. She ran extra miles, did additional push-ups, and studied her medical training materials by flashlight under her blanket. By the end of basic training, Sarah had transformed. She still looked small, but her body had become incredibly strong and her mind sharp as a blade. She could carry a wounded soldier twice her size and perform complex medical procedures under pressure. Her instructors noticed something special about her. While other medics panicked during emergency drills, Sarah remained calm and focused. She had an unusual ability to think clearly when chaos surrounded her. The real test came during advanced medical training. Sarah learned to treat gunshot wounds, explosive injuries, and traumatic amputations. She studied how to stop massive bleeding, how to keep airways clear, and how to determine which patients needed immediate attention versus those who could wait. The training was intense and graphic, designed to prepare medics for the worst possible scenarios they might face in combat. During one particularly challenging simulation, the instructors created a fake battlefield with multiple casualties screaming for help. Fake blood covered everything, and smoke machines made it nearly impossible to see. Most trainees became overwhelmed trying to help everyone at once. But Sarah moved methodically from patient to patient, quickly assessing each injury and prioritizing treatment based on who had the best chance of survival. She saved more simulated lives that day than any other trainee in her class. Her commanding officers began to take notice. They saw that Sarah possessed something that could not be taught in any classroom or training manual. She had an instinct for saving lives and an unbreakable will to never give up on a patient. Even when situations seemed hopeless, Sarah found ways to keep people alive long enough to get them proper medical care. After completing her training, Sarah received orders that would change her life forever. She was being deployed to Afghanistan with the 82nd Airborne Division. Her unit would be stationed in one of the most dangerous regions of the country, where Taliban attacks happened almost daily. Many soldiers in her unit had already completed multiple deployments and seen heavy combat. They looked at their new medic with skepticism. How could this small woman possibly handle the brutal realities of war? The night before deployment, Sarah called her parents. Her father, who had initially opposed her military service, now spoke with pride about her accomplishments. Her mother still worried but knew better than to try talking Sarah out of anything she had set her mind to do. Sarah promised them she would be careful and do everything possible to come home safely. As the military transport plane lifted off from the United States, Sarah looked out the window at the shrinking landscape below. She thought about all the training that had led to this moment, and all the lives she might be able to save. She also thought about the wounded soldiers she might not be able to help, despite her best efforts. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than any backpack she had carried during training. The flight to Afghanistan took nearly 20 hours with refueling stops. Sarah used the time to review her medical procedures one more time, making sure every technique was fresh in her mind. She also observed her fellow soldiers, studying their faces and trying to memorize their names. These men and women were now her responsibility. If any of them got hurt, their survival might depend on her skills and determination. When the plane finally landed at Bagram Air Base, Sarah felt the intense heat hit her face as soon as the doors opened. The landscape looked nothing like Texas, with its brown mountains and dusty plains stretching to the horizon. This would be her home for the next year, and somewhere in this harsh environment, she would face the ultimate test of everything she had learned. During her first week at the forward operating base, Sarah spent time getting to know her unit and learning the layout of their area of operations. The other soldiers gradually warmed up to her as they saw her dedication and competence during routine medical calls. She treated everything from minor cuts to severe illnesses with the same careful attention and professional skill. But Sarah knew this was just the calm before the storm. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy activity in their sector was increasing. Taliban fighters were planning something big, and when it happened, Sarah would need to be ready to perform under the most extreme conditions imaginable. She had no idea that within just a few weeks, she would face a situation that would test every limit of her courage, strength, and medical expertise in ways that no training could fully prepare her for. The morning started like any other day at Forward Operating Base Chapman. Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of helicopters landing and taking off from the nearby helipad. She had been in Afghanistan for 3 weeks now, and the routine was becoming familiar. After a quick breakfast of military rations and coffee that tasted like mud, she checked her medical supplies and prepared for another day of treating minor injuries and routine health issues. Her first patient was Sergeant Mike Torres, a tough infantry soldier who had developed a nasty infection and a small cut on his hand. Despite his protests that it was nothing serious, Sarah cleaned the wound thoroughly and prescribed antibiotics. Mike grumbled about having to take medication for such a minor injury, but Sarah insisted. She had seen too many small wounds turn into major problems when left untreated in the harsh Afghan environment. Around midday, Sarah was restocking her medical bag when Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison approached her. Harrison was the unit commander, a veteran of 3 previous deployments who had earned the respect of every soldier under his command. His weathered face showed the stress of leading men and women in one of the most dangerous places on Earth. Harrison pulled Sarah aside for a private conversation. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value Taliban target had been spotted in a village about 15 kilometers from their base. The enemy commander was responsible for planning attacks that had killed dozens of American soldiers over the past year. A special operations team was being assembled to capture or eliminate this target before he could slip away again. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as Harrison explained that her unit would be providing support for this mission. They would establish a perimeter around the village while the special operations team moved in. It was supposed to be a routine support mission with minimal risk of contact with enemy forces. The Taliban commander was reportedly traveling with only a small security detail. But Sarah had learned not to trust words like routine and minimal risk. She had heard too many stories from other medics about missions that went wrong in a matter of seconds. As she prepared her medical gear for the operation, Sarah packed extra supplies for treating severe trauma injuries. Something in her gut told her this mission would not go according to plan. The convoy departed the base just after sunset. Sarah rode in the third vehicle, a heavily armored MRAP designed to protect against roadside bombs and small arms fire. She sat next to Corporal Danny Williams, a 19-year-old radio operator on his first deployment. Danny tried to hide his nervousness by cracking jokes, but Sarah could see his hands shaking slightly as he checked his equipment. Private First Class Marcus Johnson sat across from them, methodically cleaning his rifle for the 3rd time that day. Marcus was 22 and had already completed one previous deployment to Iraq. He was known for his calm demeanor under pressure and had earned a reputation as one of the most reliable soldiers in the unit. Sarah felt better knowing that experienced soldiers like Marcus would be watching her back during the mission. The convoy moved slowly through the dark Afghan countryside, using night vision equipment to navigate the rough terrain without headlights. Sarah watched the landscape pass by through her tiny window, seeing nothing but empty desert and distant mountains silhouetted against the starry sky. The silence inside the vehicle was broken only by occasional radio chatter as the convoy commander updated their progress. About halfway to their destination, the convoy stopped to allow the special operations team to move ahead and begin their approach to the target village. Sarah used this break to check her medical supplies one more time, making sure everything was organized and easily accessible. She had learned during training that in a real emergency, every second counted, and fumbling around for the right equipment could mean the difference between life and death. As they resumed their movement, Sarah noticed that the radio chatter was becoming more frequent and urgent. The special operations team had reached the village and was beginning their assault on the building where the Taliban commander was believed to be hiding. Everything seemed to be going according to plan, but Sarah could sense tension building among the soldiers around her. When they finally reached their assigned position, Sarah's unit quickly established a defensive perimeter around the village. Her vehicle was positioned on a small hill overlooking the main road leading into the village. From this vantage point, Sarah could see the entire operation unfolding in the distance. Flashes of gunfire lit up the night as the Special Operations Team engaged the Taliban fighters. Initially, the firefight seemed contained to the target building. But then everything changed in an instant. Intelligence had been wrong about the number of enemy fighters in the area. Instead of a small security detail, the Taliban commander had been meeting with dozens of fighters from multiple cells. As the Special Operations Team found themselves outnumbered and surrounded, Taliban reinforcements began arriving from hidden positions throughout the village. Sarah watched through her night vision goggles as tracer rounds began flying in all directions. The careful, controlled operation had suddenly become a chaotic battle for survival. Her radio crackled with urgent calls for reinforcements and medical support. The Special Operations Team was pinned down and taking casualties. They needed help immediately. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison made the decision to move Sarah's unit into the village to support the trapped Special Operations Team. This was no longer a routine support mission. They were heading directly into a deadly firefight against a well-prepared enemy force that had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. As their convoy raced toward the village, Sarah felt a familiar calm settle over her mind. This was what all her training had prepared her for. Despite the danger ahead, she felt ready to do whatever was necessary to save lives. She had no idea that within the next few hours she would be tested beyond anything she could have imagined. The convoy sped through the narrow village streets as bullets whistled overhead and explosions shook the ground beneath them. Sarah gripped her medical bag tightly as their armored vehicle bounced violently over potholes and debris. Through the small bulletproof windows, she could see muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness from rooftops and alleyways. The Taliban fighters had turned the entire village into a deadly maze of ambush positions. Their vehicle suddenly lurched to a violent stop as the driver slammed on the brakes. Over the radio, Sarah heard the convoy commander shouting that an improvised explosive device had destroyed the lead vehicle. The blast had been so powerful that the armored truck was completely disabled, blocking the narrow street and trapping the convoy in a kill zone that the enemy had carefully prepared. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's voice came over the radio, calm but urgent. The convoy was taking heavy fire from multiple directions and could not advance further. The Special Operations Team was still trapped in the target building, but now Harrison's unit was also pinned down and unable to reach them. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and casualties were mounting on both sides. Sarah felt her training take over as adrenaline flooded her system. She grabbed her medical bag and prepared to exit the vehicle, but Corporal Williams grabbed her arm. The young radio operator's face was pale with fear as he pointed toward the windows. Bullets were striking their armor constantly, creating a deadly storm of metal fragments and sparks. Anyone who stepped outside would be cut down immediately. But then Sarah heard something that changed everything. Over the radio came a desperate call for medical assistance. 3 members of the Special Operations Team had been severely wounded and were bleeding to death in a damaged building about 200 meters away. They had managed to reach partial cover, but enemy fire was so intense that no rescue attempt had been possible. Without immediate medical treatment, all 3 men would die within minutes. The building where the wounded soldiers were trapped sat in the middle of an open courtyard surrounded by enemy positions. Any rescue attempt would require crossing 200 meters of completely open ground while under fire from multiple directions. It would be a suicide mission for anyone who attempted it. Even the most experienced special operations soldiers had concluded that reaching the wounded men was impossible. Sarah listened to the increasingly desperate radio calls from the trapped soldiers. One man was describing his wounds in clinical terms, trying to help Sarah understand what medical treatment would be needed. He had taken shrapnel from an explosive device and was losing blood rapidly. Another soldier had been shot multiple times and was having difficulty breathing. The third man was barely conscious and could not describe his injuries. As Sarah processed this information, she realized something that chilled her to the bone. She recognized the voices on the radio. These were not strangers requesting help. They were soldiers from her own unit who had been attached to the Special Operations Team for this mission. One voice belonged to Sergeant Torres, the same man whose infected hand she had treated that morning. Another was Private Johnson, who had been sitting across from her in the convoy just minutes earlier. The weight of this realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. These men were her responsibility. She had trained for exactly this type of situation, and now 3 soldiers were dying while she sat safely inside an armored vehicle. Every instinct told her to stay put and wait for reinforcements or air support that might arrive in time to change the tactical situation. But Sarah knew that waiting meant watching 3 good men die when she had the skills and equipment needed to save them. Sarah made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She began preparing her medical equipment for an emergency rescue mission. Williams and the other soldiers in her vehicle stared at her in disbelief as she organized trauma supplies and checked her protective equipment. When Williams realized what Sarah was planning, he begged her not to attempt it. The enemy fire was too intense and the distance too great. She would be killed before traveling 50 meters. But Sarah had already moved beyond fear. Her mind was focused entirely on the medical procedures she would need to perform once she reached the wounded soldiers. She calculated how much blood they might have lost and what treatments would be most critical. She organized her supplies so that everything would be immediately accessible in the dark, chaotic environment of a firefight. Sarah opened the vehicle door and stepped into hell. The sound of gunfire was deafening, and bullets immediately began striking the ground around her feet. She could see muzzle flashes from enemy positions on nearby rooftops and in windows throughout the village. The Taliban fighters had spotted her movement and were concentrating their fire in her direction. Running in a low crouch, Sarah began crossing the open courtyard toward the building where the wounded soldiers were trapped. The ground around her erupted with bullet impacts, sending up small clouds of dust and rock fragments. She zigzagged unpredictably, using every technique she had learned in training to make herself a difficult target for enemy shooters. About halfway across the courtyard, Sarah heard a bullet pass so close to her head that she felt the wind from its passage. Another round struck the ground directly in front of her, forcing her to leap sideways to avoid the ricochet. She stumbled but managed to keep moving forward, driven by the knowledge that 3 lives depended on her reaching them alive. The building ahead looked like it had been partially destroyed by explosives. Sarah could see bullet holes covering its walls and part of the roof had collapsed. Through a broken window she caught a glimpse of movement and knew she had found the location where the wounded soldiers had taken shelter. She was almost there, but the final 50 meters would be the most dangerous part of her journey. Enemy fire was becoming more accurate as Taliban fighters adjusted their aim. Sarah realized she had perhaps 30 seconds before the concentrated gunfire would make further movement impossible. She took a deep breath and prepared for the final sprint that would either save 3 lives or end 4 of them. Sarah sprinted the final 50 meters as bullets carved through the air around her like deadly rain. She dove through the broken window of the damaged building, just as a burst of automatic gunfire shredded the window frame where she had been standing. Landing hard on the debris-covered floor, she rolled and immediately began scanning for the wounded soldiers. The inside of the building was a nightmare scene. Sergeant Torres lay against a wall, his uniform soaked with blood from multiple shrapnel wounds across his chest and arms. Private Johnson was propped up nearby, breathing in short, painful gasps as blood frothed from his mouth, indicating a serious lung injury. The 3rd soldier, Staff Sergeant Kevin Murphy from the Special Operations Team, was unconscious and barely breathing, with a massive head wound that was bleeding profusely. Sarah's medical training took complete control of her actions. Despite the chaos of ongoing gunfire and explosions outside, she moved with calm precision from patient to patient, quickly assessing each injury and determining the order of treatment that would give all 3 men the best chance of survival. Every decision had to be made in seconds with no room for hesitation or second-guessing. Torres was conscious and alert, which was a good sign despite his extensive wounds. Sarah quickly cut away his uniform to examine the shrapnel injuries. Most were superficial, but 2 pieces of metal had penetrated deeply into his chest cavity. One was dangerously close to his heart, and removing it in field conditions could cause fatal bleeding. Sarah made the decision to leave the shrapnel in place and focus on controlling external bleeding, with pressure bandages and combat gauze. Johnson's condition was more immediately life-threatening. The bullet that had entered his chest had likely punctured his lung, causing it to collapse and fill with blood. Without immediate treatment, he would suffocate within minutes. Sarah pulled out a large needle designed for emergency chest decompression and located the correct insertion point between his ribs. With steady hands, she inserted the needle to release the trapped air and blood, allowing Johnson's lung to re-expand. Murphy's head wound required different treatment entirely. The bullet had grazed his skull, creating a long gash that was bleeding heavily but had not penetrated his brain. Sarah wrapped his head tightly with medical gauze to control the bleeding, while checking his pupils for signs of serious brain injury. He was still unconscious, but his vital signs suggested he might survive if they could get him to proper medical facilities quickly. As Sarah worked on stabilizing the 3 wounded soldiers, enemy gunfire continued to rake the building around them. Bullets passed through the broken windows and holes in the walls, forcing Sarah to work while lying flat on the floor. Several times she had to stop treatment and press herself against the ground as concentrated bursts of gunfire swept through their hiding place. Torres, despite his own serious injuries, was trying to help Sarah by applying pressure to Murphy's head wound. Johnson, though still struggling to breathe, was conscious enough to follow Sarah's instructions about positioning his body to help his injured lung function better. The courage and teamwork of all 3 wounded men made Sarah's job easier and probably saved their lives. But Sarah knew that stabilizing their injuries was only the first part of an impossible challenge. The 3 soldiers were alive for now, but they needed immediate evacuation to a field hospital for surgical treatment. The problem was that they were still trapped in a building surrounded by enemy fighters, with no way to safely move the wounded men to their convoy vehicles. The building where they had taken shelter was slowly being destroyed by enemy gunfire. Chunks of concrete and debris rained down from the ceiling with each explosion. The walls were being chewed apart by heavy machine gun fire, and Sarah realized that their current position would become completely untenable within minutes. They had to move, but transporting 3 severely wounded soldiers under fire seemed impossible. Sarah got on her radio and called for immediate support from her unit. She explained the medical status of each wounded soldier and requested covering fire that would allow her to move them to a safer location. But Lieutenant Colonel Harrison's response was not encouraging. His unit was pinned down by heavy enemy fire and could not move to provide support. Air support had been requested but would not arrive for at least 20 minutes. 20 minutes was far too long to wait. Johnson's breathing was becoming more labored despite the chest decompression procedure, indicating that his condition was deteriorating. Murphy had not regained consciousness and his pulse was becoming weaker. Torres was losing blood steadily from his chest wounds. All 3 men needed surgical intervention that could only be provided at a military hospital. Sarah made another decision that defied all conventional military wisdom. She would attempt to move all 3 wounded soldiers by herself, carrying them one at a time across the same 200 meters of open ground she had just crossed. It would require 3 separate trips through intense enemy fire, with each journey becoming more dangerous as Taliban fighters adjusted their positions to target her route. The first soldier she chose to move was Murphy, because his head injury made him the most critical case. Sarah fashioned a makeshift stretcher from debris and began the agonizing process of preparing him for transport. Every movement had to be careful to avoid aggravating his injuries, but she also had to work quickly because his condition was continuing to worsen. As Sarah prepared for the first evacuation run, she looked at Torres and Johnson, who would have to wait alone in the deteriorating building while she was gone. Both men understood the risks involved in her plan, but neither tried to talk her out of it. They knew it was their only chance for survival, even though it might cost Sarah her life in the attempt. Torres grabbed Sarah's hand and looked directly into her eyes. In a weak voice, he told her that no matter what happened, she had already done more than anyone could have expected. Johnson nodded in agreement, though speaking was difficult for him. Both soldiers wanted Sarah to know that if she did not survive her rescue attempt, their deaths would not be her fault. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes, but she pushed the emotion aside and focused on the task ahead. She had made her decision, and now she needed to execute it flawlessly. 3 lives depended on her strength, courage, and determination. Outside the building, enemy gunfire continued to tear apart everything around them, but Sarah was no longer afraid. She had found something inside herself that was stronger than fear. Sarah lifted Staff Sergeant Murphy onto the makeshift stretcher, her small frame straining under his weight. Murphy was nearly twice her size, but adrenaline and determination gave her strength she never knew she possessed. She secured him as best she could to prevent further injury during transport, then took a deep breath and prepared to venture back into the deadly crossfire. The moment Sarah emerged from the building dragging Murphy behind her, enemy gunfire erupted from every direction. Taliban fighters had been watching the building and were ready for her appearance. Bullets struck the ground all around the stretcher, sending up sprays of dirt and rock fragments. Sarah bent low and pulled with every ounce of strength in her body, moving as fast as possible while trying to protect Murphy from the incoming fire. The weight of the unconscious soldier made it impossible for Sarah to run or dodge effectively. She could only move forward in a straight line, pulling the stretcher behind her while bullets whistled past her head. Several rounds came so close that she felt the heat from their passage, but somehow none found their target. Sarah focused entirely on putting one foot in front of the other, refusing to think about anything except reaching the safety of her unit's vehicles. Halfway across the open ground, Murphy's weight became almost unbearable. Sarah's muscles screamed in protest and her lungs burned from the effort of dragging the heavy stretcher while wearing full combat gear. Sweat poured down her face despite the cool night air, and her hands began to slip on the stretcher handles. For a moment, Sarah thought she might collapse from exhaustion. But then she heard Murphy make a small sound, indicating that he was still alive. That tiny sign of life gave Sarah the motivation she needed to continue. She adjusted her grip on the stretcher and resumed pulling, driven by the knowledge that every second counted in saving Murphy's life. The enemy gunfire seemed to intensify, but Sarah no longer paid attention to the bullets flying around her. When Sarah finally reached the armored vehicles, several soldiers rushed out to help pull Murphy to safety. The medic immediately began checking his vital signs while other soldiers provided covering fire. Murphy was still unconscious, but his pulse was steady and his breathing had stabilized. Sarah had successfully completed the first evacuation, but 2 more wounded soldiers were still waiting in the damaged building. Without pausing to rest, Sarah grabbed a different stretcher and immediately began preparing for the second trip. Corporal Williams begged her not to go back, arguing that she had already done enough and should let someone else attempt the remaining evacuations. But Sarah knew that no one else in the unit had her medical training or experience treating severe trauma injuries. Torres and Johnson needed specialized care during transport that only she could provide. The second trip was even more dangerous than the first. Taliban fighters had repositioned themselves to better target Sarah's route, and they were now firing more accurately. Several bullets struck the stretcher as Sarah dragged Private Johnson across the open ground, but miraculously none hit either Sarah or her patient. Johnson remained conscious throughout the journey, occasionally offering words of encouragement despite his own pain and difficulty breathing. Johnson's chest wound made the evacuation particularly challenging. The bullet injury to his lung meant that any sudden movement or jarring could cause his condition to worsen rapidly. Sarah had to balance speed with smooth movement, pulling the stretcher as quickly as possible while trying to minimize the bumping and jolting that could aggravate his internal injuries. During the second evacuation, Sarah noticed that her own body was beginning to show the effects of extreme physical stress. Her hands were shaking from exhaustion, and her legs felt weak and unsteady. The repeated exposure to intense gunfire was also taking a psychological toll, even though her training had prepared her for combat situations. But Sarah pushed these concerns aside and focused entirely on getting Johnson to safety. When Sarah reached the vehicles with Johnson, the unit medic immediately began advanced treatment for his lung injury. Johnson was conscious and alert, which was encouraging, but he was still in critical condition and needed immediate surgical care. Sarah had successfully evacuated 2 of the 3 wounded soldiers, but Sergeant Torres remained trapped in the increasingly dangerous building. The third and final evacuation would be the most difficult. Torres was the heaviest of the 3 wounded soldiers, and his multiple shrapnel wounds made him extremely fragile during transport. Additionally, the building where he was waiting had sustained significant additional damage from enemy fire during Sarah's previous 2 trips. Large sections of the walls had been shot away, and the roof was on the verge of complete collapse. Sarah knew that this final trip would likely be her last. The enemy had now had time to study her route and movement patterns. They had moved additional fighters into better positions and were prepared to concentrate all their firepower on preventing her from completing the third evacuation. The odds of survival were minimal, but Sarah had come too far to abandon Torres now. As Sarah prepared for the final trip, Lieutenant Colonel Harrison got on the radio with an urgent update. Air support was finally approaching the area, and would begin attacking enemy positions within minutes. If Sarah could wait just a little longer, the airstrikes would suppress enemy fire and make the evacuation much safer. But Sarah knew that Torres did not have minutes to spare. His blood loss was severe, and any further delay could be fatal. Sarah made the decision to begin the final evacuation immediately, knowing that it would likely cost her life. She had already saved 2 soldiers, and now she was determined to save the third regardless of the personal cost. Torres was her responsibility, and she would not abandon him even if it meant making the ultimate sacrifice. As Sarah picked up the stretcher and prepared to leave the safety of the armored vehicles one last time, she thought about her parents back in Texas. She hoped they would understand why she had chosen to risk everything to save her fellow soldiers. She also thought about her father's years as a paramedic and knew he would be proud of her decision to put saving lives above her own safety. The final journey across the deadly ground was about to begin, and Sarah had no idea whether she would survive to tell her own story. Sarah ran toward the damaged building for the 3rd time, her body pushed far beyond normal physical limits. Every muscle ached and her vision was blurring from exhaustion, but she refused to slow down. Sergeant Torres was waiting alone in the collapsing structure, growing weaker from blood loss with each passing minute. Sarah knew this was her last chance to save him. The enemy fire was more intense than ever. Taliban fighters had repositioned themselves during Sarah's previous trips, and now had clear lines of sight on her route. Bullets struck the ground in continuous streams, creating a deadly corridor that seemed impossible to survive. But Sarah had moved beyond rational fear into a state of pure determination, where only saving Torres mattered. When Sarah reached the building, she found Torres barely conscious but still alert enough to help with his own evacuation. Despite his serious injuries, he had used his remaining strength to crawl closer to the window, making Sarah's job slightly easier. His uniform was soaked with blood and his face was pale from severe blood loss, but his eyes showed recognition when he saw Sarah returning for him. Loading Torres onto the stretcher was more difficult than with the previous patients. His shrapnel wounds made him extremely sensitive to movement, and he cried out in pain each time Sarah had to shift his position. She worked as gently as possible while still moving quickly, knowing that the building could collapse at any moment from the continued enemy fire. As Sarah prepared to begin the final evacuation, she heard the distinctive sound of approaching aircraft. The air support that Lieutenant Colonel Harrison had requested was finally arriving. But instead of relief, Sarah felt increased urgency. Once the airstrikes began, the entire battlefield would become even more chaotic and dangerous. She needed to get Torres to safety before the bombing started. Sarah began pulling Torres across the open ground, just as the first fighter jets screamed overhead. The sound was deafening, but it was the most beautiful noise Sarah had ever heard. Within seconds, the jets began attacking enemy positions with precision-guided missiles and cannon fire. Explosions erupted throughout the village as Taliban fighting positions were systematically destroyed. The airstrikes had an immediate effect on enemy gunfire. Many Taliban fighters abandoned their positions to seek better cover from the aerial attacks. This gave Sarah a brief window of reduced enemy fire during which she could move more safely. But the airstrikes also created new dangers, as debris from the explosions rained down across the battlefield. Torres remained conscious throughout the evacuation and tried to help Sarah by using his good arm to push against the ground. Despite his pain and weakness, he was determined not to be dead weight that might slow down their escape. His efforts made a significant difference in Sarah's ability to move the heavy stretcher across the rough terrain. About halfway to safety, a large piece of debris from an airstrike landed just meters away from Sarah and Torres. The explosion knocked Sarah to the ground and partially buried the stretcher in rubble. For a moment, Sarah thought they were both going to die from friendly fire after surviving the intense enemy gunfire. But Sarah quickly dug Torres out of the debris and resumed pulling the stretcher. The airstrike had actually helped by creating a small crater that provided partial cover from the remaining enemy gunfire. Sarah used this temporary shelter to check Torres's condition and adjust his medical treatment before continuing the evacuation. The final 100 meters to safety felt like the longest distance Sarah had ever traveled. Her strength was completely exhausted, and she was running purely on willpower. Several times she stumbled and nearly collapsed, but each time she forced herself to get up and keep moving. Torres was depending on her, and she would not let him down. When Sarah finally reached the armored vehicles with Torres, She collapsed from exhaustion. Her fellow soldiers immediately took over his medical care, while others helped Sarah to a safe position. She had successfully evacuated all 3 wounded soldiers under impossible conditions, and all 3 were still alive. The mission that everyone had thought was suicidal had been completed successfully. Over the radio, Sarah could hear that the airstrikes had broken the Taliban resistance. Enemy fighters were retreating from the village, and the special operations mission was being completed successfully. The high-value Taliban commander had been captured, and the threat to American forces in the region had been significantly reduced. Medical helicopters arrived within minutes to evacuate the 3 wounded soldiers to a field hospital. Torres, Johnson, and Murphy were all stabilized enough for transport, and their chances of survival looked good thanks to Sarah's quick medical intervention and heroic evacuation efforts. What should have been 3 combat deaths had been prevented by one small medic who refused to accept defeat. As the helicopters lifted off carrying the wounded soldiers, Sarah finally allowed herself to feel the emotions she had suppressed during the crisis. She thought about how close she had come to losing 3 good men, and how many things could have gone wrong during the evacuations. But they had all survived, and that was what mattered most. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison approached Sarah as she watched the helicopters disappear into the night sky. He told her that what she had accomplished was beyond anything he had seen in 3 previous combat deployments. Her actions had saved 3 lives and demonstrated courage that would inspire everyone in the unit for years to come. Sarah's heroic actions that night earned her the Silver Star, one of the highest military decorations for valor in combat. But for Sarah, the real reward was receiving letters from Torres, Johnson, and Murphy during their recovery. All 3 soldiers made full recoveries and returned to active duty, thanks to her life-saving medical treatment and incredible courage under fire. The story of the small medic who dragged 3 wounded soldiers to safety spread throughout the military. Sarah became a symbol of the dedication and bravery that defined the best of American military service. Her actions proved that heroism was not measured by size or strength, but by the willingness to risk everything to save others. Years later, when Sarah returned home to Texas, she continued serving as a paramedic like her father. She rarely spoke about her experiences in Afghanistan, but those who knew her story understood that they were in the presence of someone truly extraordinary. The young woman who had once been told she was too small for military service had proven that the biggest hearts often come in the smallest packages. Torres, Johnson, and Murphy remained in contact with Sarah long after their military service ended. They never forgot that they owed their lives to a brave medic who refused to abandon them when the situation seemed hopeless. Their families also stayed connected with Sarah, treating her as an honorary member who had given them back their loved ones. Sarah's actions that night in Afghanistan became part of military training curricula, teaching future medics about courage, determination, and the sacred duty to preserve life, regardless of personal risk. Her story inspired countless other service members to push beyond their perceived limitations and reminded everyone that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when motivated by love for their fellow soldiers. The village where Sarah performed her heroic rescue was later secured and turned into a strategic outpost that helped bring stability to the region. The Taliban commander captured during that mission provided intelligence that prevented numerous future attacks and saved hundreds of lives. Sarah's actions had consequences that extended far beyond the 3 soldiers she directly saved. When people asked Sarah about that night, she always insisted that she had simply done her job as a medic. She never considered herself a hero, despite the official recognition and the lives she had saved. For Sarah, the greatest honor was knowing that 3 families had been spared the devastating loss of their loved ones. The small medic from Texas had proven that when faced with impossible odds, the human spirit could triumph through courage, skill, and an unbreakable commitment to saving lives. Her story became a testament to the power of determination and the extraordinary things that ordinary people could accomplish when they refused to give up on others.